my best. Okay, you're very welcome indeed. My name is Brian Nolan, and I'm very happy to be chairing the interactive discussion that we're going to have this evening on tackling inequality. So this is the final event in the series that we've had this term, that many of you will have attended, some or all of them, focused on the topic of inequality, which has come center stage in recent times to an extent that really is quite remarkable. And I'm not going to repeat what I said in my own input at the start of this series, which essentially sought to bring out the complexity of the country experiences in terms of what's actually been happening to income inequality, and how difficult it is to trace through the impact that income inequality has on the wide variety of social phenomena and economic phenomena that it's now being commonly linked to, in terms of ordinary living standards, social ills, and of course, most recently and very prominently, to political developments here and elsewhere. But the fact that income inequality and inequality more broadly is center stage in the public consciousness, if you like, and in policy debate, that gives us a window of opportunity that really just hasn't been there before, to get a hearing for policies that seek to address inequality. Inequality, which, as we'll hear, is a very broad-ranging and nuanced concept, going well beyond income inequality. So there's no quick fix, there's no silver bullet in terms of tackling inequality, but what I'm very much looking forward to is hearing the input from the folks sitting around me here, who are going to address different aspects of inequality on the basis of their own long-standing expertise and interests, and they're going to tell us how to tackle inequality. That's a tall order, but I'm very confident that we'll all be a lot wiser in an hour's time about how to tackle inequality. The way we're going to organize it is that we're going to ask each of the panel to give us a very brief input on addressing the concrete question: what would you prioritize? What would you do to tackle inequality and its effects? We'll then have a bit of a probing of that with input from other members of the panel, really challenging the speaker, and then we'll go on to the next speaker, and then we'll open it up for a general discussion, for which we will leave plenty of time. You'll know that you have to be conscious that if you ask a question, you're going to end up being immortalized. So if you don't want to be, save your question for afterwards. So we're going to start with John Goldthorpe on my right. So John is an Emeritus Fellow of Nuffield College, Oxford, Fellow of the British Academy, Honorary Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, and I think I would summarize John's status in the field by analogy with Tony Atkinson, who I heard described as the godfather of inequality research. Well, if that's true, John is certainly the godfather of research on social mobility and social stratification more generally. And his most recent book is Sociology as a Population Science. So I'll hand over to you for your input.
Thank you, Brian. Well, I want to begin with a negative point. In current discussion of inequality and how to reduce it, there is, I think, an unduly restrictive focus on income inequality. Income inequality is, of course, important, but it's far from being the whole story. And even if we concentrate on economic inequality. So I want to argue that equal attention should be given to economic inequality in at least two other respects. The first is inequality in the accumulation of income over the life course and across generations, or in other words, inequality in wealth. It seems that of late, inequalities in wealth have widened in this and in many other advanced societies. So what might be done about this? Well, there's an old idea that Tony Atkinson, who's just been mentioned, has recently revisited that is, I think, of key importance. We need to shift the approach to taxes on wealth so that tax falls, and progressively, on the amounts that individuals inherit rather than on the amounts that individuals leave at death. Inheritance could be taxed under income tax with some appropriate averaging over time, or through some kind of lifetime capital receipts tax. But in either way, a direct incentive would be created to spread wealth more widely. An estate of, say, £1 million would attract far less tax if there were 10 bequests of £100,000 than if one person got the lot. The second form of inequality that I believe requires far more attention is inequality in the ways in which income, or more specifically earnings, are actually obtained. That is, inequalities that are built into different forms of employment contracts, considered in both their explicit and implicit features. These inequalities mean that individuals who are at much the same level within the earnings distribution may be very different in regard to the relations in which they are involved in labour markets and workplaces, and thus, in fact, living in quite different economic worlds. And I think economists overlook this point when they focus simply on the income or earnings distribution. Recently, we've heard a good deal about zero-hours contracts, agency contracts, and bogus self-employment arrangements. But what I think it's important to recognize is that these represent just one extreme in inequality in employment relations, which is a form of inequality that extends throughout the entire labour force. One important division here is that between, on the one hand, wage workers, that is, workers who are paid on a piece or now more often a time rate basis, and on the other hand, salaried employees. It can in fact be shown that as compared to salaried employees, wage workers have lower earnings security due to higher risks of job loss and unemployment, have less stable earnings on a week-to-week or month-to-month basis because of their dependency on overtime payment, shift premium, and the like. And most significantly, I think, have less favourable longer-term earnings prospects due to dead-end jobs with little opportunity for career advancement. So, what can be done about this to reduce these inequalities in employment relations? Well, I'm afraid that the short answer is that we are simply not at present in a position to formulate policy. And this is because we have no reliable, detailed knowledge of the variety of employment contracts that are in operation across the labour market and of the characteristics of the individuals to which they apply. Mrs. May has commissioned Matthew Taylor to undertake a review of workers' rights. And it's rumoured that Matthew Taylor is to carry out, I quote, an investigative roadshow around the country. Now, what this might amount to is entirely unclear, but it can, I think, be doubted if it will be an adequate substitute for the serious social survey research that is in fact required. Current employment law is clearly not fit for purpose. But if it's to be reformed, as it should be, in order to reduce the inequalities that are now built into employment relations, this can only be done effectively on the basis of a wide range of information, which at the moment we do not have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I wonder, would any of the other panel members like to probe as to what the implications are of this way of looking at it? Sandy, I'll introduce people as they're going to speak, but we're not going to delay.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that really interesting contribution. As a labour lawyer, I'd like to take up your last point about whether there's nothing that can be done because we don't have the data, and partly that there are mechanisms within the law which create incentives for people to move away from formal employment towards informal. And that's because certain employment rights are restricted to people on employment contracts. Now, if we had a floor of rights which would apply to all workers, and we didn't have the opportunity for employers to manipulate, for example, the definition of who is a worker, qualification periods of, say, 1 or 2 years, which have just been reintroduced in unfair dismissal law, exclusions from employment rights on the basis of employment contracts, I think there would be less incentive for sham independent contractors, for employers to sidestep those rights. So I think we can make progress without the data because we know enough about the structure of the labour force to say that we need to move towards a much more uniform floor of rights for everyone, which is not dependent on how the employer configures the employment contract, and which could then stop this kind of undercutting, which goes on. We could reconstruct the labour market in those kind of ways. And I think just to add one more thing to that, if there's also added to that more of a social security floor, so that the continuum between being an employee, like as you said, a salaried worker, and somebody who's so-called independent contractor but is really a precarious worker, that continuum is more, well, there is more of a continuum. So
I'm sure more could be done through employment law, and I think it's important that it should be. But the problem as I see it is this. Let's take 0 hours contracts. We've a rough idea how many people are presently employed on 0 hours contracts. But what we don't know is in any detail who these people are. And it seems to me there's a big difference between, say, a student wanting to make a bit of extra money and accepting a 0 hours contract to turn up when required to wait at a bar or a restaurant. There's a big difference between that situation and a situation where some man or woman of prime working age, perhaps with a family, can't find any other employment but a 0 hours contract. It's not that 0 hours contracts necessarily in themselves a bad thing. What's crucial is are they being entered into in a voluntary way, or are they being entered into because there seems to be no viable alternative? So we need to know not only what the range and variation of employment contract is, but who are the people who are involved in these different contracts. And as I understand it at the moment, we've very little knowledge of this kind at all.
On this last note, I mean, I can see the value of trying to gather the data, but going back to what Sandy said, because the labour market is going very fast, especially in deregulated labour market, the UK is one of the most deregulated within Europe. Is there a risk that for wanting to find the data, wanted somehow, finding, I wouldn't dare to say the perfect solution because it doesn't exist. We run a risk here that things are going faster in society and we're still trying to catch up with the data while in fact things are happening out there. And then I would like to hear your views about another thing that worries me considerably is that we are now living longer, nice things, but on the other hand, we're expected to work longer. Now, for all of us here on this panel, will probably be very nice things to do. I see colleagues here who are retired, but they're still researching, maybe even with more time than they had before when they were in employment. So, but it's all these people on this precarious employment, what are we doing? I mean, again, it goes back to this floor of rights. What are you doing, I think, about projecting, how is this going to impact in the long term on their lives and their expectancies, because they could end up in tremendous poverty once they're in old age.
Well, I agree that it's a great pity that this research that I've been talking about wasn't done sooner. And I find it baffling to know why it wasn't done. And I'm afraid I have to come back to the economists' preoccupation here simply with income earnings inequality, their neglect of the issue of how people get the earnings that they do. And perhaps I shouldn't say this because I know the Resolution Foundation supports research in this school, but I do find the concentration of the Resolution Foundation on what they call low and middle income earners really rather fundamentally misplaced. Because if you look, who are these people who are the lower and middle income earners? Socially, they're extremely heterogeneous groups, very different life stages involved in very different forms of employment relations. And we do need to start disaggregating here and looking at the relational aspects of inequality rather than simply the attributional aspects. I agree, it's a pity this research wasn't done, but I think if we do believe in evidence-based policy, this research has to be done before we get into any detailed reform of employment law.
Thank you very much. I would like to bring it back to wealth later on, which was your first focus, and maybe get a chance to defend the economists at that stage. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask Simonetta to give us her input. So Professor Simonetta Manfredi is Associate Dean for Research and Knowledge Exchange at the Business School at Oxford Brookes, Professor in Equality and Diversity Management, and Director of the University Centre for Diversity Policy Research and Practice. And so very much looking forward to hear.
Thank you very much. When I looked at this question, I thought, I think I couldn't answer to it in 5 hours, let alone 5 minutes, but I'll try to do my best. I'll stick to my notes because I've got 3 points that I wish to make. So I think that before I go into what my priorities would be, I really like to make a preliminary consideration, and this is that there are many dimensions to inequality, of course, income inequality, we're talking about that, but also there are inequality linked to personal characteristics, gender, age, disability. We will hear later on about gender. And this multiple dimension of inequality can often compound or intersect and create even greater challenges for individuals and for the society as a whole. For example, women who are more likely to be at risk of, we know they're more likely at risk of old age, which means that the mix of gender, age, and income inequality can create disadvantage and undermine the dignity of women in this group. So at the risk of stating the obvious, I would say that when we think about solutions, we really need to think about the different dynamics of inequality and disadvantage. We need to think about, how then to tackle those different dynamics. But going back to the question, how do we counteract the inequality-generating forces with equality-generating solutions? So I've got 3 points that I would like to make, 3 priorities. The first one that I've chosen is I think we need to reframe the public debate around equality. The second, to ensure that economic institutions take more responsibility to tackle inequality. And the third, to make an effective use of legislative tools to reduce inequality. So the first one, to reframe the debate and the narrative, I would like to take the example of equality rights in the workplace. Now, since the financial crisis and during the coalition government, we heard that the law often referred to equality rights as red tape, a burden on business. As highlighted by Professor Linda Kings, this provides a sense of déjà vu because it takes us back to the conservative governments in the 80s, 90s. Again, they were talking the same equality, portraying equality as hindering business competitiveness. However, on a possibly more positive note, on the diversity management that I've done work on, you can reconcile the business dimension, the business interest, with the equality and the business, through the business case, which postulates that pursuing equality goals in the workplace can lead to increased productivity and ultimately financial returns. However, I would argue that the pursuit of equality is neither red tape or a burden on to businesses, nor a means to achieve greater profitability. So equality is an end in itself, because we know we're all born equal, we all deserve the same kind of respect. So I think that the aims of equality cannot be asserted through the logic of market fundamentalism, but they need aim through a subordination to business objectives, but they really need to be asserted through values of social justice, dignity and solidarity, which must replace the business-driven narrative. My second point relates to the economic institutions. Now, I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I want to focus on the corporate sector. There has been an awful lot in the press recently about it. And I like to, the corporate sectors, as we know, can be or contribute to those generating forces of inequality. And the influence of these companies, I think, has been well described by Sir David Walker, who asked by the British government to undertake a review post-financial crisis. And speaking on the BBC in January 2016, I quote, he said, "The boards of major companies exert more influence on the well-being of society and people in our country than any other groups or other elected representatives or their regulatory agencies." I think this quote says it all. So tackling inequality is absolutely crucial to the well-being of society, and I would say that this calls for the greater democratic legitimacy of company governance. Now, we have heard the right noise, the rhetoric seems to be developing in the right direction from the Prime Minister. However, the idea, for example, making companies more accountable, but the idea of including workers on company board hasn't survived the first encounter of the Prime Minister with the CBI. And I'm sure that it hasn't escaped you that you read the paper and every day this proposal are getting diluted and diluted. My third point, and last, is about the tools. Legislation as a tool for bringing social change, and Sandy is a great expert of that here. And I think that the challenges of globalization, in my view, have demonstrated the importance of having common, enforceable, minimum standards of employment rights, including equality rights. As the UK is embarking on Brexit, I'm sorry I couldn't resist it, as you can guess, I was a Remainer, I am a Remainer, embarking on Brexit, I mean, I think it is essential that especially the equality rights, many of which derive from European legislation, that we need to think, and hopefully be maintained in national legislation. But what worries me is that we am I going to lose that lack of enforceable collective commitment if we are not member of the European Union. So these rights, in other words, yes, they could be replicated in domestic legislation, but then they're going to be at the mercy of domestic politics. And then I couldn't resist to ask a rhetorical question, is this about taking back control, or is it about losing control on key equality rights? I also wish to refer briefly, I'm almost completed, to something that happened again very recently. It's the Select Committee on Equalities has asked for more transparency needed from the Treasury on equality analysis. But we have the public sector equality duty. Sandra has written extensively about it. So why are they not, which in a nutshell is a piece of legislation that is putting equality, or is intended to put equality at the core of public sector, the decision-making process of public authorities. The government seems to have consistently failed to use that duty effectively. And on this occasion, members of the Treasury, the Minister from the Treasury were actually called to come and talk, give evidence to the committees, but they refused to do so. I think they dismissed on the grounds that equality considerations are taken into account by the different departments. So somehow they gave up their responsibility on that. So the point that I want to make here is that yes, it by all means is not perfect, but we do have some legislative tools which already exist, but they're not being used effectively. And I wish to conclude by also saying we are witnessing now a political environment which is fast moving to the right in Europe, in the US, and inequality is being exploited by the demagogues, which is very worrying to create divisions. So I think that addressing the causes of inequality must be absolutely a priority on both social and political agenda, but in different aspects, civil, political, social, and economics. Thank you.
Much. Would anyone like to? Yes, please.
I'd like to ask you about how realistic you think it is to look to the business world, to look to especially private companies to seriously tackle questions of economic inequality, even in the workplace. I've some experience of this in the field of social mobility, where, as you will know, governments try to encourage firms to take serious action to widen the range of recruitment to their top positions. They've even produced some kind of grading system for firms in this regard. As I read the evidence, nothing very impressive has been achieved in this way. Of course, as you say, private companies have got the power to do a great deal in this direction, but have they got the motivation? Why should they want to take this on board? You can argue that they would benefit from more meritocratic selection to their higher level positions, but they may believe that the methods they presently use are meritocratic, even if it doesn't broaden the basis of their recruitment. And how do you challenge them on this?
Yes, I think you're right. I don't disagree with you. That's why I think I'm critical of the fact that the reform on corporate companies, as I say, is being diluted by the day. You do need that legislative underpinning. Otherwise, why business should be doing it? So I agree on that. On the other hand, I think that legislative underpinning, or sometimes the threats of a more robust legislative underpinning, might get them into doing something about it. We have the recent case of the debate on increasing women representation on company boards, for example, and although that has been by and large voluntary, entirely left to the voluntary initiatives, and nonetheless, I remember Vince Cable saying that the threats of a directive from the EU about quotas was seen as a kind of nuclear option, which provided some motivation for doing the things. But no, if you leave it entirely to them, they won't do it. That I think that's for sure. That's why also I think we need to change the narrative. We've gone too far in trying to evolve this down voluntary approach, trying to persuade them on the grounds equality is good for business. It can have some traction from a practical point of view. They may listen to it and engage, but the reality is we need to do it because it's important for the cohesion of our society.
And following through on exactly that point, I mean, I suppose that takes us to the general point as to whether inequality is not tackled effectively because we don't know what to do or because of power.
I think so.
So in this instance, I mean, I think the example you use of the very high profile commitment to having workers on company boards, and alongside that, an absolutely unambiguous commitment to control top pay. and to have transparency around top pay. And on the second, there has been an equal rollback. In fact, at least as rapid, that really has been watered down very extensively, to the point where the Financial Times writes an editorial saying, what are companies worried about here? They're clearly concerned about transparency, because in some sense they must feel they have something to hide. Yeah. So these are not issues where we don't know what the technical fix is. That we can debate the technical fix, but it's about whether the state is willing to take the step of imposing it's binding regulations.
Exactly, it's a political will.
Yeah.
That at the end of the power relation, the political will. We can discuss about all sorts of solutions, but at the end of the day, that is a key.
So that's something we might come back to in a moment. But at this stage, I'd like to move us on to ask Professor Sandy Fredman to give us her input. She's co-director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Human Rights for Future Generations, Rhodes Professor of Laws of the British Commonwealth and the USA in the university, and Fellow of the British Academy. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Well, I want to concentrate on women and on gender. The facts are very stark of inequalities between women and men. We know, and these are probably familiar figures, but certainly worth repeating, that globally the gender pay gap is still 24%, and it's much wider in some countries. Women are still segregated into lower paying portions of the labour force, far more in clerical and administrative jobs. Women predominate in exactly the kind of workforce which you're talking about, the precarious workforce, and in other countries where the formal sector is quite small, women predominate in the informal sector and also in the less secure, more precarious parts of the informal sector, although the whole informal sector is insecure. Violence against women is huge and probably not fully accounted for. And what we know is, as a particularly important causative factor, is that women still do double the amount of unpaid care work than men on average. But in some countries, particularly in developing countries, women do far more than that of the unpaid work. So the reason that the reason I focus is that the inequalities between men and women worldwide are still so stark. And how do we move forward on this in terms of the very first step is to be able to understand the forces behind what continues to drive this. I should have added that in the recent World Bank report, they found that of the 143 countries they surveyed, 90% still had legislative restrictions on women. 90%, which is an extraordinary figure. So, as well as highlighting that as a major form of inequality, I think it's very important because given the debate that's going on and has always been going on in a sense between identity politics and class politics, perhaps we might call it, but one that's come up even again this post-Trump era. For gender, it is extremely important that we see the way in which these issues interlock and the way in which what we might call the recognition or identity aspects feed into disadvantage. So what I've been working on for some time now is understanding equality in a four-dimensional way, which looks at disadvantage, stigma and stereotyping, lack of participation, and lack of structural change or transformation. And in order to understand the ways in which and how to break these patterns of which are so obstinately resisting change, we need to recognize how gender-based stereotypes are so central to women's continuing disadvantage. The fact that women are still attributed with the primary responsibility for unpaid work is a central driving force into their lack of security in the workforce, because the kind of jobs that they can choose they have far fewer choices and feasible choices. Gender-based stereotyping also feed into violence against women, and that goes across the spectrum from harassment at work to the extraordinary high numbers still of girls that get married off under 18, and even I think there's some of 8% of girls between 20 and 24 were married under 16 still in the world, which interferes with education and interferes with any kind of ability to progress. Women still have far less access to resources because of the way in which power within the family is distributed. So we need to be able to see the interaction between gender-based stereotypes and stigma, which is what I call my second dimension, and the first dimension, which is socioeconomic disadvantage. But the third dimension is equally important, which is lack of voice, which is both around political power, and you mentioned power, the way in which power continues to entrench inequality is something which needs to be fully addressed. And the fourth dimension is about really thinking hard about structural change, so that it's not enough for some women to get onto corporate boards, or which is really important if they do, but if that's done because the childcare and the unpaid work is being done by other women who are much less well paid, who are in fact almost by definition poorly paid, by the very growing proportion of migrant domestic workers who are women, who have very few rights, then we are not achieving the kind of structural change which is going to be lasting and which is really going to address that kind of inequality. So as I say, the pressing problem I put forward is gender inequality, and I think to think about it at least, and then to devise solutions, we need to address it through thinking about the interaction between economic disadvantage, stereotyping, stigma, violence, which is the second dimension, lack of voice in political participation, and the extent to which we are not really addressing these structural obstacles. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You want to first come in?
No, you go ahead, please.
No, I wait for one, sorry.
Sure. So I suppose I would. So clearly you've very effectively highlighted the extent and nature of the inequalities across a range of dimensions, and the need to address the underlying structures. How does one go about doing that? What are the routes? You talked about rights and enshrining rights in legally. Is that where you would look first? Or how does one, so you can talk about changing the way issues get framed and debated, clearly as a means to bringing about structural change, but if you had the lever, what lever would you pull first to bring about structural change? What would be that change?
Well, I wish I had the lever, but I don't think there is a silver bullet, and I think we all have to acknowledge much as we would like to. One of the important, so we obviously need to deal a little bit differently with formal labour markets and informal labour markets, but and developed countries and developing countries. So, but if we think about the developed country scenario for the moment, the redistribution of caring work is crucial. So what I've advocated and fought for a long time, strong maternity rights of pregnant women, rights to remain in the workforce. But I think we've reached a point now where we need to think as much of getting women into the workforce as getting men into the home. and recognizing that that unpaid work is a joint responsibility for both men and women and for society more generally, because we could not survive as a community if we didn't have children, if we didn't bring them up well, and if we didn't value them and put the effort into that. So at least from the developed country perspective, and I think it's just slightly different in different kind of societies, but we need to focus on equalizing parental rights and on the changing of the culture so that everyone regards it as a responsibility to look after children, and that there has to be an input as well socially from the state. So it's not just employer-worker bilateral relationship, but that it's seen to be an input, a social input to our children and our elderly population, which everybody subscribes to. So by recalibrating the burden or value, the actually great appreciation of unpaid caring work, I think would go quite a long way towards giving people a whole lot of other different feasible choices which are not gender-based.
So my question was, and it's good you said already this, because who needs to act here? You know, one can talk in abstract terms. Where does the action comes from? Is this about legislation? I mean, we're using terms like cultural change. It's good to, but what does it involve?
Well, as a lawyer, I guess we always think about legal change, and as an economist, you say how the laws don't work, or we don't have the data, and we need to talk to each other a lot more clearly. So far as whether we could start with legal change, we have to start with legal change which genuinely is value-driven in genuinely the correct ways. So thinking about, say, parental leave, there has been a push towards parental leave, but because it's unpaid, the economic incentives within the household still move towards leaving it to the woman to take the maternity leave, because the woman, it's just the family economics, which I'm sure you would subscribe. So if we're going to change that, we have to properly equalize it so that the economic incentives push or pulling people to using their rights properly. So that could be one way of thinking about it. I mean, I do think that there is, and I agree very much with Simonetta, that there's a strong role for the law, because there have been many attempts at voluntary change which just don't happen. So, but we do need to, and I also agree with John that it needs to be properly evidence-based. But as a lawyer, I would kind of start with legal change.
Maybe we want to revisit in the debate. Sandy, you said something that I've been pondering on considerably about, going back to the agenda of bringing more women on company boards, or indeed more women in leadership roles in decision making. And I think you make a very powerful point. There are lots of women who are in very poorly paid jobs, all that. And if some of these women end up in position of decision making, maybe because some of those who do some of this work. And so it's a very powerful point. But I've been thinking, I'd like to hear what you think. I'm still pondering on this because they are quite big questions. On the other hand, for example, go back to the corporate boards. Getting more women on corporate boards is just not just getting more women. To me, I think it's a way, the way I see it could be a way of bringing more democratic legitimacy on those boards, opening up. So I hear what you're saying. As I say, I've been pondering a lot on it, but on the other hand, that also it's an important action that we need to take. It's neither or one or the other, because unless some of this, we talked about power, these points where the power is, unless that changes, sometimes maybe the change at the top might facilitate the change at the bottom. However, it could be seen in another way. This is trickle-down equality, and like trickle-down economics might not work. So I really don't know. It's just a point that I've been thinking a lot about it.
While you're thinking about that, I might just let John in and then come back to you.
Yeah, I noticed that you made this distinction between the formal and the informal economy. And that's a distinction I always have some difficulty with. It suggests to me too sharp a dichotomy, and perhaps as a labour lawyer you could elaborate a little on what exactly this distinction implies, because it does seem to me that may be very important in the case of women workers. I'm thinking of the case of the women cleaners in London hotels that was in the news recently. Now, as I understand it, they were employed by a cleaning company to whom the hotels contracted out this work. I would have thought formally, since there was no problem here, they were part of the formal economy, or would they count as informal in some way? I mean, they seem to have appalling conditions of work, but I would have thought they were still part of the formal economy.
Yeah.
Yes, well, thanks to both of those really challenging questions. I also ponder about women on corporate boards, and I think there have to be many multifaceted approaches. And I don't think it should be a question of one or the other. I do think that we've been working very hard on what you call trickle-down equalities, and I think it's important for us to recognise that they are really not sufficient. We have a woman prime minister. It's not enough. We have to have we have to work on the whole of the structure. So at the same time as we might be having more women on corporate boards, which I think is important for itself, I think we should not lose sight of the domestic workers who are largely migrant and the importance of giving those women rights. And the new ILO convention, not so new anymore, on domestic workers is a really important push in that direction to providing a floor of rights so that everybody's work is dignified and everybody's work is regulated, which also very much helps with making sure there isn't undercutting and protects workers, all workers, when they know that everybody is it's the old sort of sweatshop thing, that if you underpin everybody's rights, then other people can't undercut them. On the formal and informal, I agree, we can use these terms. In labour law, it's not really as much of a term of art as to look at whether you have an employment contract which entitles you to statutory employment rights, which is a more limited notion than workers who are also entitled to discrimination law rights and so on. So we do need to, you're quite right, talk about it in a much more nuanced way. But as far as the hotel workers are concerned, one of the key problems which does need to be addressed through labour law is agency workers, because who the employer is, there's a bifurcation between the hotel who's telling them what to do and the agency which is kind of paying them. And those kind of workers often fall between the stools because the two sets of employing bodies pass on the responsibility to the other one. And that's why I said in the beginning that I think that the law as it stands actually encourages and incentivizes the use of the labour law in order to avoid giving workers the rights that they deserve, because you can very much manipulate the relationship between the end user and the agency in terms of who is responsible for what. And actually, I don't even think we need the data that you talk about for us to be able to give sensible policy which would plug that hole. You can make both of them jointly and severally liable, and then they can work out between them how to distribute the responsibility. Whereas at the moment, and I do think it's deliberate flexibilization of the workforce, that the legal system encourages that, and I don't think it's a mistake or something that's been overlooked. I think it's been done on purpose in order to create these what are called flexibilities.
Thank you very much. If I could just move us on now to Stefan Dercon, who's Professor of Economic Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government here, and also Chief Economist of the Department of International Development since 2011, and Director of the Center for the Study of African Economics, which is enough to be going on with.
Absolutely.
Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. So, I mean, as my background probably will explain already, that I want to bring this here to kind of more the global inequality side, and maybe implicitly making the argument that however worthy and important some of the things that are being discussed, actually within a picture, in a global picture, there's some other challenges that I would like to argue that actually even bigger and more important in it. For those who have been coming to these lectures, they will have enjoyed Branko Milanovic early on in the term, talking with lots of nice little pictures and so on. But, you know, Branko, as a master of the numbers, has been very persuasively describing and discussing, first of all, actually, that sometimes gets a bit forgotten that his numbers show global inequality has been going down. But actually, of course, in a very particular way, that the one that we're all familiar with, because it keeps on being repeated in the press, is that when it comes to rich economies, the lower middle classes and the lower classes have actually gained very little, and the richest group have actually gained a huge amount in this period. But of course, the other part of this global inequality story has been of a lot of groups that actually were poor, or very much call it very lower middle class in their own countries, not notably in China and East Asia, but also across the world, across India, all the way in Asia, to actually become emerging middle classes. And actually the income gains and the growth that it's been having has actually been contributing to this global inequality, actually in lots of the indicators to have gone down. Now that's quite important because, you know, the inequality discussion that we're having, we wouldn't have been having if we didn't have these stylus facts about what is happening here. But actually, I want to argue that the story that is happening in other places and the risk of marginalization globally are probably even more important for our long-term importance. It has inequality elements in it, and I'll come to that. But the simple statistic should actually help to make my point, is that globally, it is still the case that 75% of the inequality is actually between countries. Only 25% of the inequality is within countries' inequality. The gaps between countries are far bigger than the gaps within countries. And that's still important to know, because it is still about countries that are actually staying behind. Indeed, this distinction has gone down a little bit because it used to be 83%, but the gap between countries has slowly declined a bit, and that's again largely thanks to East Asia moving up. But there's still huge inequality, even in some of these places where it's been happening. A simple way of representing this is, you know, let's take OECD incomes in purchasing power of 2011, some kind of dollars that you can compare across the world. You know, it's about 40,000, the GDP per capita in OECD, just under that. Africa, it's 9% of that number. That's the kind of gap. Of course, it means there's still very poor countries. In fact, the poorest country, the gap with the richest and poorest country, will be more than 50, 60 times there. But there's a huge gap. South Asia, that we're all saying, you know, India booming and whatever, and a threat to our economies, it's 14% of OECD incomes. East Asia is interesting because in purchasing power, it's getting close to this 50%. It's about 45, a bit more than 45% by now. And that is actually for the first time, in the last 30 years, we had for the first time since the 18th century, a part of the world converging back to the industrial world, to what we call the OECD countries, essentially. That's been converging back to it, or I should have said more clearly, relative to Western Europe and the US. So this convergence happening. The gap is still half, you know, it's still behind, but still progress. But I want to focus for a moment on the lower end of distribution, because I think for us being concerned with global inequality, I do think we should really carefully look what's happening on that end of the distribution. If we then look over time, what's been happening, and again, the stylized facts may hopefully still surprise some of you, and if you all know it, then it's brilliant, because I feel like often people don't really appreciate it. But if we go back to about 1980, there are probably about just under 2 billion people in the world that were living below
about what we now would say an international poverty line that is over time comparable. Now it's $1.90 in 2011 dollars. But it's basically under $2 roughly as the dollar is worth now. There were about, and in purchasing power also, so in real terms at the time, about 2 billion people below it. But actually more than 1 billion of these were living in East Asia. And about 500 million were living in South Asia, a bit more than that, and about 200 million were living in Africa. Actually, if you at that time put all poor people, extreme poor people, as we would recognize it in a way that we can compare, in a hat, and you randomly took out someone, the odds would be that the nationality would be Chinese. Okay? You would be likely to pick a Chinese person. The kind of change we had over time is quite dramatic, because by 2010, it's probably about 900 million people are below that kind of line. Okay, we could argue about that line, but it's still worth drawing it somewhere. It's about 10% of the, well, it's about 900 million were there. And it's, by then, it would have been about 400 million in South Asia and 400 million in Africa. So actually in Africa, because population growth, poverty reduction didn't keep up. In Asia, in South Asia, it kept up and actually managed to decline. East Asia, it was becoming very, very small numbers, 50 million, 60 numbers, 70 numbers, relatively speaking to that. So at that time, a random poor person picked out of a hat would actually have been the Indian national. Actually, today, if we pick a random poor person, he would be still in India. But where the change is coming very dramatically and very fast is actually very striking. Any projection we make looking forward would actually suggest that by 2030, at current projections, we would think probably about 450 million people would be below this line. Massive progress, 5.4% of the global population. Actually, there is really a trajectory. But of these 450 million, probably 400 million would be in Africa. And actually, Asian poverty, compared to 1980, would be, in that extreme form, would have actually been eradicated. Doesn't mean that all these people are rich and driving Ferraris. Of course not. They've all just moved up a little bit, and we should not underestimate that. But in this kind of global comparison, we're getting a big change. And that change is very dramatic. A random poor person by 2030, if you pick them out of a hat, the likely nationality is going to be Nigerian or from the DRC. Now think of what you know of these countries. They are tricky countries, more difficult countries. And in fact, we know that increasingly poor people live in conflict-affected and fragile states. Messy places that actually, and that's actually where, quite interestingly, where the inequality story feeds in. This is not about vertical inequality, say income or wealth inequality. Very little evidence suggests that that kind of inequality drives conflict or fragility in countries. It is much more what people call horizontal inequality. Similar people, actually some getting a big piece of the cake and the other one doesn't get it. Between ethnicities, fights between elites, people grappling for natural resource wealth, because a lot of these places have lots of natural resources. Indeed, all kinds of fights that actually are to do with horizontal inequality in a broadly defined thing. And that's actually quite important. Now, we're getting a world where the bottom end is really very messy places. And this is where an inequality dimension plays in. It's the intra-country inequality in horizontal sense that often feeds a lot of these conflicts. This is a tricky one because it's very hard to do much about that. But it's an important one. Now, where does it fit in the UK? Where does the UK then fit in it? So this is another final thing, and I'm bombarding you with statistics, or at least trying to get you some stylized facts. But if you take the bottom decile, the bottom 10% in the UK, the poorest 10% in the UK, so where would they fit in that global income distribution? If we believe the newspapers, they clearly are, quote unquote, as deserving as the world's poor. Actually, they would fit around the 75th percentile or the 80th percentile in the world income distribution. So it's still 75% at least of the global population is poorer than what we consider the poor people here in income dimensions. If you do it in other dimensions, you're not going to get a very different answer in that respect. So that's actually quite important. So where does it leave me? And I come to the last bit. What can we do about this kind of global inequality where there's still an awful lot, and this changing phase of poverty that is there as well? So I want to, a couple of points, because of course it's extremely tricky. The more poverty becomes linked to conflict and fragility, the harder your normal ways of dealing with poverty reduction are actually disappearing. Simply, the states don't have authority and legitimacy, or they're very weak, So how can you provide aid to a state to actually make sure social services are going to function, or that indeed social protection is in place, or income distribution? These are places often with very, very weak state capabilities. But it's still the case that development and a development focus should hopefully help them out of some of these kind of situations. And indeed, sometimes we still say, could we create a situation that actually elites that may want to fight about it have maybe more to fight about in the context of a stable economy in a changing phase of an economy or something. Basically, for example, that you don't end up all the time fighting over natural resources, but you have an economy for whom instability is not a good idea. And that actually you have a stake in that economy. In a way, as we also, as our own economies have developed, where for elites, the economy, there was a stake in the economy, and as a result, legitimacy came from trying to also protect the stability of your societies. But that's one thing. Development focus should be there. At the same time, let's be conscious that there's only a lot of places, especially in Asia, a lot of people have only just got out of poverty. And that's still, of course, a kind of a risk. And importantly, in both of these agendas, so let's please not, by having a rediscovery of inequality, whether it's in a populist agenda or in a political agenda or indeed in an intellectual agenda, forget that actually a renewed focus on the inequality here, that it then starts disengaging us from that part of the world, becoming isolationist and so on. And that, I think, that's a big risk at the moment. However, I will be the first one to say that trying to engage globally, you need to also have local legitimacy. And it's very hard, working as DFID, to keep on having to defend that we're doing 0.7, while at the same time there may be perceptions that actually other people are staying behind. It's not easy to go and say that we're going to spend a big sum of money, 20, 30, 40 million pounds, on setting up a social protection system in Zambia, so that the poorest people have a stake, where certain things may be perceived, and I'll be careful, it's broadcast, that actually things are happening in your own society where maybe cuts have to take place in certain aspects of these services in your own country. So you need to also have a way of getting that local legitimacy. And I think internationalists as myself, working on development and so on, we should remain conscious that legitimacy will start locally and at home. And we'll have to make sure that we link these narratives. But there is hopefully also intellectually a narrative. With the changing phase of poverty in these very fragile and conflict-affected states, one thing we of course are learning, and maybe which explains also some of the kind of pushback we have in our own society against it, is that these things spill over. Conflict spills over into refugees, spills over into other things. Conflict spills over into conflict and maybe in extremism and issues to do it as well. Global terrorism are not unrelated to conflicts that are happening to do with horizontal inequalities in countries. So that is definitely a rational argument to make, that trying to invest just here to keep everybody safe may also have a national security and national interest to do that actually in the countries where things are happening. So in conclusion, there's a long-term agenda still on global inequalities. I think the inequalities that I'm really concerned with is that groups of countries really staying behind and risking losing our attention. Within these countries, there's an element of horizontal inequality that drives it. That is not easily tackled, but it's not about charity there. This is about much more careful engagement with these countries. This is not just about, as long as we vaccinate, surely that country will stop being fragile. It is a different thing that we need to do. And it also means this is not just about writing checks for aid. This is not a debate on aid, should we spend aid or should we not spend aid. This is actually, and that's both intellectually and practically engaging on a lot of non-aid agendas. Some are the normal ones, but it is indeed, where is multilateralism at the moment? And do we have new answers for multilateral action? China is growing. Do we have systems and structures where we can engage other new nations and that are emerging to actually in multilateral action? It is indeed, and people talk a lot about, maybe labor movement, but other people put against it, it's a lot to do with the capital movement. Do we have a proper handle on the way capital move across borders, whether it's to finance terrorism or indeed illicit flows and corruption? And indeed, it's working on political legitimacy, not on short-term agendas, but on long-term commitments. I'm an economist. I do believe that economic development engagements with these countries is more than ever necessary. Again, because I can't see very many other theories of change, that is, we can get elites to have a stake in the stability of their societies and their economies, which will come by building up economies as well, then actually will also get more chances for doing again, working on the inequalities in these countries. It's not going to be easy. This is a messy place, the world, but we knew that for a long time.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of my responsibility to give you an opportunity to input, but I can't resist asking Stefan one question before doing so. And that is that the common narrative now, of course, is that there's, I think, increasing recognition of the very dramatic falls in global poverty and more recently inequality that you've described. But married to the notion that the price we've had to pay for this has been the growth in inequality, sometimes dramatic, sometimes much less so, in the rich countries, and all the consequences that have flowed from that, arguably, including political, and that this is in some sense a natural pushback, what Branko Milanovic would call the driver of his Kuznets waves, is that this is a political reaction to something that really isn't sustainable, however welcome one might regard the global implications. Yeah. So what's your response when faced with that by a pragmatic politician who says, I hear what you're saying, but we just can't do this anymore?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah.
I just wanted to also ask whether you thought the Sustainable Development Goals were any way of a solution, because I noticed you didn't mention them, and the fact that now they don't only, just fitting into your question, they don't only apply to developing countries, but they apply across the board, and also they have a link for the first time to international human rights.
If I could, a very short answer on the last question is actually saying, the Sustainable Development Goals are great, and having a blueprint to turn the world into Sweden, I totally agree with. But the world is a messy place, and I think one of the weaknesses of SDGs, it doesn't tell us how we get there. Just having targets without any realistic theory of change or model or a way of getting there is not as helpful as it could be. But there's nothing wrong, basically, with trying to turn the world into Sweden. So but on the challenge that Brian is putting me, which is arguably it's harder. It is worthwhile again to try to disentangle various aspects of globalization. And I just don't have the time to do this in detail. I mean, it definitely has something to do with technology as well, but it also has something to do with labor and with capital. And when we lump the two parts exactly in the same boat, I think it's where we get into trouble. And let me be precise. I think globalization has been an incredible driver to trying to bring jobs to where poor people are. They've been moving jobs to poorest people, poor workers were in East Asia, in Asia. It's been an incredibly important driver to bring them. That's not necessarily the cause why the jobs here disappeared. In fact, the evidence would not at all support that. Technological change has been more important for the jobs disappearance here in proportionately. Because actually, this kind of new trade relationship and this new globalization in trade it's never been a zero-sum game. Trade is not a zero-sum game, as all these processes have not. Well, global economy in this age of globalization has grown. The cake has been massively gone bigger. This is not simply about a piece of the cake has been taken and then a move there. Now, I could make an argument, and I'm not a specialist in it, and I know there's other people in the room that actually say, well, maybe the way that globalization played through in certain sectors. I come from Belgium. We, in any case, did it much slower in our textile sectors than this country did it. Now, we can analyze that, but we have a far more flexible labor market in the UK than the way globalization was allowed to play through in continental Europe, which fewer, not necessarily with but with fewer of these dramatic consequences of disfranchisement. But that's the way you manage the process. But I want to say on the labor side, it's been crucially important to actually the poverty reduction in countries like China, but also, for example, in Bangladesh. the textile jobs have been incredibly important. One of the three main drivers, the other one is migration actually, and the third one is NGO activity on the ground for poverty reduction and female empowerment. The textile sector, this kind of changes has been dramatic for development in a very broad sense, not just about incomes. Same time, something has happened with capital. And capital is also been moving, and probably even faster and more flexibly. And there, even in a policy environment, even in UK and as a DFID, there's a real concern there. There is an incredible, the issues on illicit flows, beneficial ownership, all these kind of things that have actually helped that 1% of the richest to get much richer. I don't think they've done it necessarily at the cost itself of these poorest people itself, but they've definitely taken lots of taxpayers' money away from and not being taxed and managed to get their wealth through. It's a different side. On the capital, what's happened on the capital side and on the labor side. And my biggest worry is that now we'll close the world, and the last continent that desperately needs this globalization to actually start being beneficial for itself, because it's at the moment only damaging it, because the capital is already happily flowing out and the corruption and whatever. But for the first time, the jobs may flow to Africa, and now we're going to stop it. And that would be the biggest drama we could have, because we'd marginalize that continent forever.
Thank you very much. And just to say that I'm not going to give you an input from myself, but what I have written down here is exactly on the point you were making about capital and about the implications of globalization for the erosion of the tax base in the rich countries. And the fact that one positive development has been the very widespread unease about the extent to which taxation of top wealth holders and of companies, the extent to which both have been able to avoid paying their fair share, and the extent to which there has been some real progress coordinated through the OECD in exchanging information and in closing loopholes and in getting some degree of a handle on these flows. And I think that there has been genuine progress, but that is a very direct reflection and a response to the very widespread popular unease about this, which is linked to perceptions of inequality, and so I think that's perhaps another positive note. I'll now open it up and feel free to take any of the points and direct your questions towards any of the speakers. First hand up was right down the back, so fair is fair.
Thanks for the comments to the panel. My name is Erinch Sahan. I lead the private sector team at Oxfam. My question sort of unpacks a little bit what Professor Dercon mentioned at the end in capital versus labour, and it felt like we teased it a little bit but didn't really unpack that it's the growth of returns to capital versus growth of returns to labour that's underpinning a lot of this. But we've hardwired companies to maximise returns to capital. Everything in the boardroom must happen in a way that maximizes returns to capital. And there's probably a power discussion there around how we can restructure companies. And with mechanization on the way and talking about sort of potentially 90% of jobs in garments in Southeast Asia potentially being replaced by robots, in agriculture we've got similar, disruptions potentially on the way. Do we need to rethink the way we've designed, because it's a human-designed instrument, the company, and think about how do we make sure that those corporate decisions are done in the benefits of other stakeholders, and just to prod things like employee ownership, which is the fastest growing form of business here in the UK?
While Stefan's thinking about that, I guess my immediate response would be that the first thing we have to do is change the way top managers are paid, which has been entirely counterproductive, even in terms of investment and macroeconomic performance.
Yeah, and just a very quick answer is, on the one hand, I agree, but we have to be very careful that we don't treat it in a static way. The returns to labor in these East Asian countries has gone dramatically over time. Making these, because in the end, Marx's writes, the poor have but their labor to sell, and the tighter we make these labor markets, the more these wages will go up. And so actually, that process of moving capital to these places was very important, even if they were driven by trying to get that return to capital. The wages have been going up. This is why Africa now gets a chance, because China is getting too expensive. But having said that, I agree with you, and it's an interesting point that you make. You know, at the moment, there's noise, for example, on, you know, DFID is supporting and putting capital into the CDC, that you will be familiar with, which basically, as a kind of an equity investor, frontier investor in poor and fragile places, that it needs to do this, and people are all saying very worried. It's interesting. The incentive scheme that I was part of designing actually incentivizes a trade-off between labor intensity of the industries that they're getting, and secondly, how difficult the countries that they're investing in. And that's how the bonuses of the people working in there are done. Maybe other companies could take some example from that.
Very interesting. I saw a hand here, and I saw a hand then here. So, yep, no, you're next. Yep.
Yes, thank you. My name is Jacob Ben Chaim. I'm an Oxford Martin visiting fellow. Certainly, the elimination of poverty is essential for enabling the realization of the human potential. And so the efforts of this panel and many others are very important. I would, however, add that economic inequality, and I'm thinking in the context of within a state, a Western liberal democracy, economic equality is in certain senses in tension with individual freedom. In particular, economic equality via transfer payments is in tension with property rights. And property rights are one element in the maintenance and stability of Western liberal democracies. Property rights are one element in the sustaining innovative progress of our societies. So there is a tension between the obvious and laudable importance of reducing inequality and the no lesser importance of the individual freedoms, in particular property rights, but also of other sorts. My question is, how do you balance between the importance of economic inequality, or eliminating it, and maintaining the individual rights of the members of your society? Thank you.
John, would you like to have a go at that?
Yeah. Well, it's an old issue, and I wouldn't disagree that there is a tension, and I would see it as a tension that has to be resolved politically through the operation of the democratic process. What I would perhaps question in your position is that the notion of property rights somehow descends from heaven as a form of natural law. The existence of property rights is itself a political creation. They have no particular natural form. What property rights exist in a society is something that's emerged out of a political process over many years, and there's no reason why we shouldn't change that if we want, again, through a democratic political process. So I do get worried when economists of you might call a Hayekian persuasion talk about property rights as if there was some form of natural law. They're just as politically created as any other set of law. And so equally, there's no reason why they shouldn't be changed, one would hope, through a democratic process. I don't see that anybody has got some kind of natural right to leave all the wealth that they've accumulated during their lifetime to some particular person without some form of taxation being paid. We can change it as we see fit.
Lots to talk about.
Yeah, and I would put it empirically here. Even the IMF, probably not known for its left-wing thinking, brought out a whole series of very careful papers that's, I mean, if your argument is right and we need to do it, now actually the evidence would suggest is that definitely high levels of inequality are stifling growth. And that's, that's now perceived wisdom in the empirical work in various ways. You could even question it, but it's very hard to kill off that kind of result. it's not so clear. That doesn't mean necessarily that no inequality is good for growth, but it's definitely when high inequality is definitely there. So there's definitely, even if you were right that there may be some incentive, the bounds that we observe in certain countries, basically the extremes of it, are really stifling also growth potential of these places. So, yeah.
Thanks. Sue Led with Ruskin College. I'd like to raise the question around collective solidarity and labour. We've heard about labour and capital, but one of the casualties, I guess, particularly in the global north of globalisation, has been the decline in trade unionism. And that's partly to do with the nature of trade unions as political and highly gendered organisations themselves. But in this country particularly, of course, our legal constraints have gone beyond anything reasonable. Just thinking back to a previous recession in the Netherlands, and we heard about contracts, 0 hours contracts and so on. In a previous recession in the Netherlands, rather than have half the workforce working extremely long hours and the other half not having work, the trade union movement and the government of the day, in fact, came to agreements about work sharing, severe reduction in working week and hours. And one of the factors around gender particularly, and the equalisation of family roles, is the long hours culture, which we still have, even though we've got precarious work and 0 hours contracts. Now, one of the really important aspects would be a rebalancing, if you like, of the power relations between capital and labour through trade union organisation. And I would be one of the first to say that trade unions need to think really hard about how they accommodate the situation that we find ourselves in. But nevertheless, the way in which state control of trade unionism has developed seems, well, certainly in some research, indicates that that has contributed towards inequalities, the big inequalities that we have. So any comments on that score?
Well, mostly that I agree entirely with what you say, and in particular, although you said initially that globalization was causing the decline of the trade union movement, I certainly think that what you said later is the truth in this country, that legal restrictions have been the primary driver of the decline of the trade union movement, and the restrictions which were brought in under the Thatcher government and have been increasingly, like the trade unions have been increasingly throttled. So I definitely think part of the idea of valuing solidarity and also valuing participation by everybody in the workforce would be to allow trade unions, but also for trade unions to themselves change to include workers with precarious work. And there have been some really interesting examples of organising domestic workers, and there is now, and particularly the ILO Convention on Domestic Workers was a result of trade union organising among domestic workers, and that's a very good example of how trade unions could change, but they do need to be in the right political environment, and I hope that there are economic figures which show that actually decent work and people feeling some kind of ownership also make them better.
I'm just conscious of the time. If you don't mind, I think I'd like to let another couple of questions in. Sorry, I think somebody has a mic there, and then here.
A quick one. I just wanted to comment on this, on the role of temporary work arrangements and in general labor market segmentation. I was kind of surprised to learn that there are not data on the actual contracts for the UK, but we can learn from the experience of other countries. I've done extensive research on Italy, and we know what happened in Germany, in Spain, in other places, and everywhere. An important part of the solution, I totally agree with you, is providing a universal floor of rights to all workers, irrespective of their contract. Now, another thing, and in this, I really would like also to defend the economic professions somehow. So, in a sense, the inequality in the type of contract is still, you can think of it as income inequality, but in a dynamic perspective. Because what happens is that if you have a temporary contract, that really changes your future prospects of getting another job. So everything is fine as long as the economy is buoyant. And this actually brings me to the last comment, the fact that here in the UK, we might actually are accumulating a huge problem that will explode at the next recession. As this type of workers is increasing, we don't see, it's not a problem now because the chances of finding a job are good for everyone. But in the next recession, then we might see that a big chunk of the labor force is basically cut off the labor market.
Thank you. There was a question here.
Hi, I'm Tanvi. I'm a current MBA student. I would like to present a solution and then ask for your response to... We've been working on this a lot in the MBA. On Professor Goldthorpe's question on how realistic is it to expect business to take more responsibility, and can we motivate them somehow? And the solution is two-pronged. One is internal, where we see now that diversity is more and more seen as a necessity for a sustainable company, not just in board representation, but throughout the various managerial hierarchies of a company. So that could be a motivator for companies to hire people with different perspectives and different socioeconomic backgrounds. And the second motivation would be, as Professor Dercon said, there's a market of 2 billion people that is largely marginalized at the moment and also neglected. So that is a huge market for any company to enter into. So with these two internal and external motivators, I would say there's a strong case for businesses to embrace the issue of inequality. And I would like to hear your views.
Maybe you might both, Simonetta, do you want to deal with that?
I think that, I think you're partly right, that yes, a lot of businesses now are quite embracing that agenda to use that. But I think if they do, it's because they've started doing it because there was some kind of drive either from legislation or from the state. It doesn't come naturally. Then they may internalize it. Yes, there have been some quite good examples, but I think that is, if we go back to the women on board example, where does that come from? It comes from the European Union, who said, well, we decided that was going to be a priority, starting threatening introducing a quota legislation, etc., and then UK responded with this. But the UK government set up an initiative, and now some of them have internalized it. Some of them, I think, you might be claiming this diffusion theory because others are doing it, so we also feel to need to do it. But I think you need that impetus coming from either law or state or some kind of external initiative, because otherwise I'm not quite sure. In terms of all those people, well, it depends on what, because inevitably, business are businesses. That said, we might want, still through that impetus of legislation, trying to encourage them to be more responsible, because they don't operate in a bubble, because they operate, they as, going back to what was said, they can have a huge impact on society, and then see themselves as part of a social agenda, but not pretend that it's a business agenda, it's a social agenda that we want them to work with governments and other trade unions to be part of that social agenda.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm aware that there were more hands, and I apologise to those who didn't get in. Blame it on my poor chairing. But it's good to end with still enthusiasm in the room. So could I just, on your behalf, thank the speakers very much for not only giving the time this evening, but giving the thought and effort that went into their inputs. So on your behalf, I'm going to... and to thank